Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening a file that has been sitting on the desk of the American consciousness for, well, for over 2 decades.
Mm-hmm.
It's a case that completely dominated the headlines, it changed laws, and it created a media circus that, in a lot of ways, really set the template for how we consume true crime today.
It really did.
We're looking at the murder of Laci Peterson.
Right.
But before you roll your eyes and say, oh, I've seen the movie, or, oh, no, he did it, just pause for a second. Because the version of this story that lives in our collective memory it's really just a highlight reel. It's the movie of the week version.
It absolutely is. I mean, it's one of those cases that everyone thinks they know. You just mentioned the name, and people immediately, they have an image in their head.
Totally. The dyed hair.
The dyed hair, the boat, the press conferences, Amber Frey. But when you actually sit down with the source material, and we're talking about, thousands of pages of court transcripts, the appeal rulings, the forensic pathology reports, and even the very recent filings from 2024 and 2025, you realize the popular narrative just misses so much of the nuance.
Exactly. And that's our mission today.
Mm-hmm.
We are not here to rehash the tabloid drama. We're not here to judge the players based on their haircuts.
Right.
We want to strip all that away and look at the factual timeline, the granular forensic evidence, and the really complex legal battles that are literally still happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
Because, and this honestly surprised me when I was digging into the stack you sent over, this case did not end with the verdict in 2004.
Well, far from it. As recently as June 2025, there were court rulings handed down regarding this case.
That's incredible.
The Los Angeles Innocence Project has stepped in, which is a massive development. So this is very much an active, evolving story. But to understand where we are now and understand why a prestigious organization like the Innocence Project would even touch this, we have to go back to where it all started. We have to set the scene properly.
Okay, so let's do that. It's Christmas Eve, 2002, Modesto, California. And if you were looking for a postcard of the American dream, this was pretty much it.
Mm-hmm.
Modesto is this agricultural hub in the Central Valley, tight-knit, very community-focused.
Mm-hmm.
And you have this young, attractive couple, Scott and Laci Peterson.
Right.
They've got the nice bungalow on Covenant Avenue, the golden retriever named Mackenzie in the backyard. And most significantly, Laci is 8 months pregnant with their first child, a boy they've already named Connor.
And that imagery is just, it's so crucial to understanding the public reaction. The tragedy of this case is amplified by that setting.
Yeah.
Laci was 27 years old. By all accounts, she was the absolute heart of her family, vibrant, high energy, the kind of person who just lights up a room.
Yeah.
And she disappears while supposedly walking her dog on the morning of Christmas Eve. In an instant, that picture-perfect holiday scene just dissolves into a massive search operation and a media frenzy that I don't think Modesto or the country really was ready for.
And right from the jump, you have this central tension that we're going to be exploring throughout this entire deep dive. On one side, you eventually have a prosecution case that's built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence.
Almost entirely.
There was no weapon found, no bloody crime scene in the house, no eyewitnesses seeing a struggle.
Oh, nothing.
And on the other side, you have a defense that claims this was a classic rush to judgment, that the police, they fixated on the husband immediately and just ignored every other possible lead.
That is the core conflict. Can a mountain of circumstantial evidence equal proof beyond a reasonable doubt? In the court of public opinion, the answer was yes, almost immediately.
Right.
But in a court of law, it's much, much stickier. So let's unpack the players first. Because to understand the dynamics and to even begin to understand the why, you have to understand who Laci and Scott were before all the satellite trucks parked on their lawn.
Okay, let's start with Laci. She was born Laci Rocha in 1975. And reading through her background, she sounds like a force of nature.
She really does.
Grew up visiting her father's dairy farm. She was a cheerleader in high school. But she wasn't just, bubbly. She was driven. She went to Cal Poly and majored in ornamental horticulture.
Which I think speaks volumes about her personality and her attention to detail.
How so far?
Well, ornamental horticulture isn't just, oh, I like flowers. It's science, it's design, it's planning. She loved gardening, cooking, entertaining. The sources describe her as striving to be the perfect housewife, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way at all.
No, not at all.
She took immense pride in it. She was a huge Martha Stewart fan, which is a detail that, believe it or not, becomes a critical piece of evidence regarding the timeline later on. She was just completely devoted to creating a home. That was her passion.
So she's the nester. She's the one building the foundation for this family.
Exactly.
And then you have Scott Peterson. Born in 1972, grew up in San Diego. And here's a detail that I hadn't really focused on before, but it feels like a key to his psychology. He was a serious golfer.
A very serious golfer. He wasn't just a weekend warrior. Get this. He was teammates with Phil Mickelson in high school.
No way. Really? Phil Mickelson?
The Phil Mickelson. That gives you a sense of the level of competition he was used to. He was one of the top junior golfers in San Diego. He actually went to Arizona State on a partial golf scholarship.
Okay, so that's a high-pressure environment.
Yeah.
But things didn't exactly go according to plan there, did they?
No. And this, I think, gives us a little glimpse into his trajectory and maybe his ability to pivot or, mask failure. He was allegedly kicked off the team.
Kick off.
Well, the story that circulates is that he took a potential recruit out for a night of drinking, which was a huge violation of team rules. His father later testified that Scott was just discouraged by the sheer talent gap. Seeing guys like Mickelson up close, he realized he wasn't going to be the pro he thought he was.
So he hits a ceiling.
He hits a ceiling. So he transfers, eventually lands at Cal Poly, and he pivots to agricultural business.
Where he was, by all accounts, a model student.
Absolutely. His professors loved him. One even said, quote, "I wouldn't mind having a class full of Scott Petersons." So right there, you see this ability to charm authority figures, to present himself as the golden boy, the guy who follows the rules and gets the A's.
He knows how to play the part.
Precisely. He's
Yeah.
polite, he's polished. He meets Laci at a cafe in Morro Bay where he was working as a waiter. And Laci actually made the first move. She sent him her number on a napkin.
That fits her personality.
Totally. They get married in 1997, and for a while they own a sports bar called The Shack in San Luis Obispo.
Right. I remember that detail. Which sounded fun, but they eventually sell it to move to Modesto, Laci's hometown, to start a family.
Mm-hmm.
And on the surface, the Modesto life looks great. Scott is working for a fertilizer company, Trade Corp, as a sales rep. He's making about $5,000 a month, which in 2002 is pretty decent salary.
It's a good living.
They have the house, the country club membership.
Mm-hmm.
But when you peel back the layers, was the financial reality actually matching the image?
Not quite. It was. It was a bit of a facade. Sources indicate they were living beyond their means. They had about $23,000 in credit card debt.
Okay, so 23 grand. It's not an insurmountable amount. It's not millions.
No, it's not. But for a guy who, seems to pride himself on success and image, and you combine that with a baby on the way, which brings a whole new set of costs,
Yeah.
And that's pressure.
It's the keeping up with the Joneses trap. So you have the financial pressure, you have the pressure of impending fatherhood, which we'll learn later Scott might not have been exactly thrilled about, and the pressure of maintaining this perfect couple image.
Right.
That brings us to the timeline. We need to go hour by hour here because the window of time in this case is incredibly small. It's almost suffocatingly tight.
It is razor thin. I mean, if you blink, you miss the opportunity for this crime to have occurred. Let's look at December 23rd, the day before the disappearance.
Okay.
And it's 5:45 p.m. Scott and Laci go to Salon Salon. This is where Laci's sister, Amy, works. Amy cut Scott's hair. This is important because it establishes his appearance right before everything happens, and it puts witnesses in the room with them, seeing them act like a normal couple.
And what does Scott say he's doing the next day on Christmas Eve?
He tells people there that he is planning to play golf.
Golf. Okay, not fishing. That's a very distinct change of plans.
Correct. He mentions golf to the family and to the people at the salon. That evening, around 8:30 p.m., Laci talks to her mother, Sharon, on the phone, and that is the last verified contact that anyone in her family has with her. Laci Peterson is never heard from again.
Wow. Okay, so now we move to December 24th, the morning of the disappearance. Scott's account of this morning is the baseline we have to work from because there are no other witnesses inside that house.
That's right.
He claims he last saw Laci at 9:30 a.m.
And according to Scott, the morning was completely domestic and normal. Laci was watching Martha Stewart Living. Specifically, he said she was watching a segment on meringue.
Okay, that's a very specific detail.
It is. He says she was preparing to mop the floor, bake cookies for Christmas, and then take their dog, Mackenzie, for a walk. Scott says he decided at the last minute to skip golf because it was too cold, about 50 degrees, and go fishing instead.
Okay, let's pause there for a second. 50 degrees is chilly for golf, I guess. But is it, let me drive 90 miles to the bay to stand on a cold boat weather?
That is the question the detectives asked immediately. It seems like a strange trade-off. But that's his story. He decides to drive 90 miles to the Berkeley Marina to fish for sturgeon.
Okay, so he leaves at 9:30 a.m. Now here is where the timeline gets really, really tight. The neighbors. This is the part that always trips me up when I look at any of the intruder theories.
This is the critical window of opportunity. A neighbor, Karen Service, finds the Petersons' dog, Mackenzie, wandering alone in the street with a muddy leash still attached.
A muddy leash.
A muddy leash. She takes the dog and returns him to the Petersons' backyard, closing the gate. She later testifies that this happened at 10:18 a.m. She knows the exact time because she was heading out to an appointment.
10:18 a.m. Okay, let's do the math. If Scott left at 9:30 and the dog is found wandering alone at 10:18, that means Laci disappeared or was taken or something catastrophic happened within that 48-minute window.
Exactly. And frankly, the window might be even tighter than that. If Laci finished watching the show, got ready, put the leash on the dog, and started her walk, you could be looking at a matter of just a few minutes.
It leaves very little room for error if you're talking about a random abduction.
Very little. A random kidnapper would have to be watching the house, waiting for Scott to leave, and then snatch a very pregnant woman walking her dog in broad daylight in a safe neighborhood, all without anyone seeing a struggle or hearing a scream.
And without the dog going ballistic.
Well, Mackenzie was a golden retriever, so maybe not the most aggressive guard dog, but yes, the silence is very notable.
So Scott goes fishing. He says he gets back in the afternoon. At 2:15 p.m., he leaves a voicemail on Laci's phone. It sounds normal. Hey, beautiful, I'm leaving Berkeley. He gets home, finds the house empty. The dog is in the yard where the neighbor left him. And then what does he do?
This is where his behavior starts to get flagged by law enforcement later on. He showers, he washes his clothes, he eats some pizza.
Okay.
Then he calls Laci's mother, Sharon, and asks if Laci is there with them. But he doesn't sound particularly panicked yet, according to her. The police report is finally filed shortly before 6:00 p.m.
And when the officers arrive, what do they find?
They arrive, they do a search of the house, and they find Laci's keys, her wallet, and her sunglasses still in a closet.
That is a massive red flag. I don't care who you are. An 8 months pregnant woman going for a walk is going to take her keys, or at least some ID. And sunglasses in California, it's almost automatic.
It is. It suggests she either never intended to leave the property for very long, or she was taken against her will very abruptly before she could grab any of her essentials.
The community response was almost instantaneous. Modesto mobilized in a way that was, truly impressive. You had 900 people searching, a command center set up, a huge reward that eventually reached $500,000.
The whole community came together.
But while the volunteers are out there putting up flyers and searching parks, the detectives, Brocchini and Bueller, they're getting a weird vibe from Scott.
This is that gut feeling factor, which is, it's controversial in court, but it's very real in an investigation. Detectives deal with grieving spouses all the time. They know what panic looks like, what desperation sounds like. And they describe Scott as polite and arrogant, disaffectedly distant.
Disaffectedly distant. That's a powerful phrase. One detective noted that Scott wasn't asking the normal questions a frantic husband would ask.
Right.
He wasn't asking, will you call me back with any news, or what are you doing next, or do you have any leads at all? He was just there. It's almost like he was waiting for them to figure it out, or maybe just waiting for them to leave.
It was a passivity. That's what struck them as so odd. And then they check his alibi. He claims he was fishing at the Berkeley Marina.
The 90-mile trip.
The 90-mile trip on Christmas Eve to sit in a small boat in cold water to fish for sturgeon. It's odd to begin with, but what's weirder is the gear he had. Sturgeon fishing usually requires heavy tackle, live bait, very specific setups. Scott had a brand new rod, seemingly the wrong lure, and he was only out there for a very short amount of time.
So it looks like he's just going through the motions of fishing.
It does. It's a very strange choice, but as we always say, being weird isn't a crime. You can be a bad fisherman and not be a murderer.
True.
However, the investigation takes a massive, massive turn with the arrival of a woman named Amber Frey. This is the moment the case pivots from a missing person search to a potential homicide investigation, at least in the eyes of the public.
Absolutely. This changed the entire texture of the case overnight. So in November 2002, that's a month before Laci disappears, Scott meets Amber Frey, a massage therapist, through a friend. He tells her he is single.
Classic cheating behavior. Scummy, but not illegal.
Right. But then, on December 9th, and this is the date you have to circle in bright red, he tells Amber something absolutely chilling.
And let's just put that date in context. December 9th is 2 full weeks before Laci disappears. Laci is alive. She's talking to her mom on the phone. She's going to the doctor. She's preparing the nursery.
She is very much alive.
Correct. But Scott Peterson tells Amber Frey that he is a widower. He says this will be his first Christmas without his wife.
I mean, could we just sit with that for a second?
Yeah.
That is, it's horrifying. He is telling his mistress that his wife is dead, creating this whole sympathy narrative while his 8-month pregnant wife is sitting at home, probably knitting booties or something.
It's what prosecutors later called the smoking gun for premeditation. Because how do you explain that away? It's not just lying to get a date. It's literally declaring your wife dead before she is actually missing.
It suggests he knew she wasn't going to be around for Christmas.
It implies a plan, a very dark one.
So Amber Frey sees the news coverage in late December. She sees Scott Peterson on TV, the man pleading for his missing wife to come home, and she realizes that's the Scott she's been dating.
Can you imagine that moment?
I can't. So she contacts the police on December 30th, and she agrees to cooperate.
And cooperate is putting it mildly. She becomes essentially an agent for the state, a star witness. She agrees to record their phone calls.
So the police are listening in.
They're listening to everything. And Scott, who has no idea that she knows, continues to lie to her. There are tapes that were eventually played for the jury where Scott claims he's in Paris celebrating New Year's Eve at the Eiffel Tower.
What?
He's describing the fireworks, the celebration. In reality, he's in Modesto, in the middle of this massive search for his wife.
The level of compartmentalization there is,
Okay.
It's actually terrifying.
Yeah.
To be able to romance a woman over the phone, inventing a trip to Paris, while your world is collapsing and your pregnant wife is missing, it just paints a picture of a sociopathic liar.
And it absolutely destroyed his character in the eyes of the public and eventually the jury. Laci's family, who had supported him up to this point, they turned on him immediately after Amber's press conference on January 24th.
I can't blame them. But despite all this suspicion, despite the lies, they still didn't have a body. They had no physical evidence of a crime until April.
April 2003. A massive storm cycle had just moved through the Bay Area. On April 13th, a couple walking their dog at Point Isabel Regional Shoreline in Richmond finds the body of a male fetus washed up on the shore.
Connor.
And the next day,
April 14th, a human torso was found about a mile away from where the baby was found. DNA confirms it is Laci and Connor Peterson.
Right. And we have to talk about the location. Point Isabel is very, very close to the Berkeley Marina.
It's essentially the same area where Scott said he went fishing.
Exactly. So his alibi, the one thing that was supposed to exonerate him, actually placed him at the exact site where the bodies eventually washed ashore months later.
The statistical probability of a random kidnapper taking Laci from Modesto and then happening to dump her body in the exact spot Scott went fishing 90 miles away is...
No.
It's infinitesimal.
And beyond coincidence.
The condition of the remains was...
Yeah.
It was horrific. And we need to discuss this because it relates to the forensic theories and some of the wilder satanic cult theories that popped up later. Laci's body was missing the head, arms, and lower legs.
It was. And naturally, that leads to speculation about dismemberment. Did the killer cut her up to hide her identity or make her easier to transport?
Right.
But the forensic pathologist, Dr. Brian Peterson, no relation to Scott, testified that there were no tool marks on the bones, no saw marks, no knife scrapes, nothing like that.
So how does that happen then?
The expert consensus is that the separation of the limbs was consistent with a body that had been weighted down in seawater for several months.
Okay.
The body decomposes, gaseous bloating occurs, which makes the body want to float. But if the limbs are anchored or snagged, the joints eventually give way due to the currents, the tides, and, marine scavenging. Essentially, nature did that damage, not a saw.
And Connor, the baby.
Connor was relatively intact. The pathologist described what happened as a coffin birth phenomenon. It's a gruesome term, but essentially the gases from decomposition in the mother's body build up pressure and eventually expel the fetus.
Wow.
He was found separate from Laci, and there was some nylon cord wrapped around his neck, but the origin of that cord was never conclusively determined. It could have just been debris in the bay.
The prosecution's theory was that Scott weighted Laci's body down to keep her on the bottom of the bay. And this brings us to the concrete anchors. This is where we get into the sort of Home Depot forensics of the case.
Right. So police found one homemade concrete anchor in Scott's boat. It was made from a bucket of cement. But when they searched his warehouse where he stored the boat, they found a bag of cement powder, a sledgehammer, and something else. Marks on the floor of the boat trailer.
What kind of marks?
Specifically, there were 5 circular marks in the dust that perfectly matched the size of the bucket he would have used to make the anchor.
Okay, so the math is, there were 5 marks, which implies 5 anchors were made.
Oh, 5 anchors were made.
But only one anchor was found in the boat. So where are the other four?
Exactly. The prosecution's theory was that he used the other four to weigh down Laci's body one, tied to each wrist and ankle.
Which would explain why those parts of the body were missing or separated. The weight would have held them down while the rest of the body eventually floated up.
That was the theory. A very powerful, very visual theory for the jury.
But they never found those other four anchors in the bay, did they?
No, they brought in sonar, they had divers, everything. But the San Francisco Bay is murky, it's deep, and it has incredibly strong currents. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack if the haystack was underwater and constantly moving. It was an impossible task.
So once the bodies were identified, the police moved in to make the arrest. April 18, 2003, they arrest Scott in Loyola, which is near San Diego, close to a golf course. And this arrest, it didn't look like a guy who was just going to play 18 holes.
It really didn't. When they pulled him over, his appearance had drastically changed. He had dyed his hair and his beard a sort of bleach blonde color.
He claimed that was from swimming in a friend's chlorinated pool.
He did. The police, of course, saw it as a pretty clumsy disguise.
And the car. It was packed like a go bag for a fugitive on the run.
It was. He had camping equipment, survival gear, 4 different cell phones, $15,000 in cash, and his brother's driver's license.
15 grand in cash and his brother's ID.
Oh, and a dagger. And Viagra.
To the police, this just screams, I am running to Mexico.
Which is only about 30 miles away from Loyola. The prosecution argued this was consciousness of guilt. You don't pack your car like that unless you're planning to flee.
What was the defense's explanation for all that?
Later, at trial, they would argue he was essentially living out of his car to escape the intense media harassment because he couldn't go home. And the brother's ID, he claimed, was just to get a resident discount at the Torrey Pines golf course.
That's a creative explanation for the ID, I'll give him that. But the totality of it, the hair, the cash, the 4 phones, the location, it just looked terrible.
It looked incredibly damning.
So, Scott is arrested. The trial begins. And this was the Super Bowl of trials at the time. You had Mark Geragos for the defense, who was this big celebrity lawyer, very charismatic. And you had Rick DeStasso for the prosecution, who was more of a grinder, very methodical, very detailed.
And the prosecution's strategy was clear. Motive and opportunity. The motive. Financial freedom, freedom from the responsibilities of fatherhood, and of course the desire to be with Amber Frey. They painted Scott as a man who viewed his unborn child and his wife as an anchor dragging him down, pun intended.
They leaned heavily on that widower comment to Amber Frey as proof of premeditation.
Absolutely.
And the fact that he was fishing at the body dump site.
Yeah.
But it was all circumstantial. And I think that's what people forget. There was no DNA in the house, no blood, no eyewitnesses seeing him carry a body out to his truck.
Which is why the defense, led by Geragos, thought they had a real chance. Geragos used what we call the CAD defense.
The CAD defense.
He basically stood up in court and said, look, Scott Peterson is a cheater. He's a liar. He treated his wife terribly. He's a CAD. But being a jerk doesn't make you a murderer.
He tried to separate the moral failings from the criminal act.
Exactly. And Geragos had some strong moments in that trial. Let's talk about the Martha Stewart tape. This is one of those details that really makes you question the competence of the initial police investigation.
This was a big gotcha moment, wasn't it?
It was a pivotal moment in court. The police had claimed that Scott lied about Laci watching a segment on Meringue on Martha Stewart Living on the morning of December 24th. They testified, we checked the TV records, that segment did not air on the 24th. They used this to argue his entire timeline was a fabrication from the start.
But
Geragos did his homework. In the middle of the trial, he rolls in a TV and plays the actual tape from that morning. And the segment on Meringue did air. It aired exactly when Scott said it did.
oh, that must have been electric in the courtroom.
It was a huge blow to the prosecution's credibility. It made the police look sloppy, or worse, like they were suffering from confirmation bias and just ignoring evidence that didn't fit their theory about Scott.
So that was a win for the defense. But they also made some serious mistakes.
They did. They brought in an expert witness, Dr. Charles March, to talk about the baby's age at the time of death. They tried to argue that Connor died after December 24th.
Which would completely exonerate Scott because he was under constant surveillance after the 24th.
Right. It was their Hail Mary play. But under cross-examination, Dr. March just imploded on the stand. He admitted he based some of his crucial calculations on a friend's anecdote about a pregnancy test, rather than hard medical records from the case file.
You can't do that.
You can't do that. He actually got frustrated at one point and said to the prosecutor, "Cut me some slack."
Oh no. You never, ever want your expert witness telling the prosecutor to cut him some slack. It just sounds like he's guessing.
It completely destroyed his credibility. And it hurt the defense's other alternative theories, like the satanic cult theory or the idea that she was abducted by the burglars from across the street.
Right, the burglary. This is the thread that the Innocence Project is really pulling on now, isn't it?
Hmm?
There was a burglary at the Medina's house, directly across the street from the Petersons. The defense argued that Laci might have come out, seen the burglars in the act, and been killed to silence her.
And the police dismissed this. They said their investigation showed the burglary happened on December 26, 2 days after Laci was gone, which was based on when the neighbors returned home from their trip. But the defense insisted there were witnesses who saw a suspicious van there on the 24th. It remained a major point of contention.
And then there was the hair. A single hair found in a pair of pliers on Scott's boat.
Right. Mitochondrial DNA matched it to Laci. Now, mitochondrial DNA isn't as precise as nuclear DNA. It can only trace maternal lineage. So it matches Laci, her mother, her sister, etc.
But combined with the context.
Combined with the context, it was powerful. The prosecution's argument was simple. See? Her hair is on the boat. She was on the boat.
And the defense's argument.
The defense said she's his wife. Her hair is on his clothes, in his car. He probably hugged her that morning, then went to the boat. It's called secondary transfer. But visually for the jury, linking her biological material directly to that boat, which was the alleged vehicle of disposal, was just damning.
The jury deliberations themselves were filled with drama. They had jurors getting kicked off left and right.
It was chaotic. The original foreman was removed because he said he felt threatened and asked to be let go. Then another juror was removed for doing her own independent research. She was basically playing detective, checking the interiors of vans, which is strictly forbidden.
Wow.
It was a mess. But eventually, on November 12, 2004, the newly constituted jury reached a verdict.
Guilty. First-degree murder for Laci. Second-degree for Connor.
And they recommended the death penalty. At the sentencing, the judge called the crime cruel, uncaring, heartless. Scott was sent to San Quentin's death row.
And for most people, that's where the story ends. Scott's on death row. Case closed. Justice served. But the legal system grinds on very slowly, and it corrects itself in strange ways. Let's fast forward 16 years to 2020. The California Supreme Court makes a huge ruling.
A huge ruling.
Yeah.
They upheld the conviction, meaning they agreed the evidence was sufficient to prove that he is guilty, but they overturned the death sentence.
And why was that? Was it new evidence? A witness recanting?
No, nothing like that. It was a procedural error that happened all the way back during jury selection in 2004. It's what's known as a Witherspoon error.
Okay, what does that mean?
The trial judge had dismissed potential jurors who said they personally opposed the death penalty without asking the critical follow-up question. Despite your personal beliefs, can you still follow the law and impose it if the evidence requires it?
So they were kicked off just for having an opinion.
Exactly. By dismissing them automatically, the Supreme Court ruled that Scott was denied a truly impartial jury of his peers, a jury that represented the full community. It was a clear-cut error.
So the guilt stands, but the punishment changes. In 2021, he is resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Correct. The prosecution decided not to retry the penalty phase. They figured life without parole was sufficient, and it would spare Laci's family the trauma of going through another high-stakes trial.
But Scott's legal team wasn't done. And this brings us to the habeas petition and the involvement of the Los Angeles Innocence Project in 2024. This is where things get really interesting for people following the case today. The Innocence Project. They don't just take any case. They are incredibly selective.
They are. And their involvement signals that they believe there is a genuine, credible avenue for exoneration, or at the very least enough evidence of reasonable doubt that wasn't properly explored at trial.
So what are they focused on?
Well, there are two main prongs to the current fight. First, there was the issue of juror number 7, a woman named Rochelle Nice.
The media called her the strawberry shortcake juror because of her bright red hair.
That's the one. The defense argued she was a stealth juror. It turned out she had been a victim of domestic violence in a past relationship. She had actually obtained a restraining order while she was pregnant.
Okay.
But on her jury questionnaire, when asked if she had ever been a victim of a crime or involved in a lawsuit, she answered no.
So the defense's argument was that she lied to get on the jury, specifically to punish Scott, because she projected her own trauma being a pregnant woman threatened by a partner onto the Laci Peterson case.
It's a compelling argument on paper. If a juror lies to get on a panel, that's serious misconduct. But in December 2022, a judge ruled against Scott. The judge said the false answers were due to a good faith misunderstanding of the legalistic questions and sloppiness, not intentional deceit or bias.
So the judge didn't think she was trying to be a stealth juror.
No. The judge ruled that Rochelle Nice didn't view herself as a victim in the legal sense, so she didn't disclose it. It was a huge blow to the defense.
So that door closed. But in January 2024, the LA Innocence Project steps in with a focus on actual physical evidence. What exactly are they looking for?
They are looking at a piece of duct tape.
Duct tape. Where does this come from?
During the autopsy, a link of duct tape was found adhering to Laci's pants. The Innocence Project argued that this piece of tape might contain DNA from the actual killer, maybe one of the people involved in that burglary across the street, or a kidnapper.
Their theory is that if Laci interrupted a burglary, the burglars might have used tape to bind her.
Precisely. And here is the specific detail they are banking on. The tape had a fold in it. If someone tore that piece of tape with their teeth or handled the sticky side, their DNA could be trapped and preserved inside that fold, protected from the water and decomposition.
That's fascinating. And they also wanted to look into a van fire that happened nearby and re-examine the burglary evidence, right?
They filed motions for all of it. Full discovery on the original burglary investigation, the van fire, everything. But in May 2024, the judge ruled against most of it, granting testing only on that piece of duct tape. The judge said the other issues had already been litigated or were irrelevant.
So everything hinges on this one piece of tape. And where does that stand now?
As of June 2025, so very recently, an appeals court denied their broader petition for habeas corpus. They rejected the claims that the prosecution suppressed or destroyed exculpatory evidence related to the burglary. But the DNA results on that tape. That is the lingering question mark.
So we're literally waiting on a lab result 20 plus years later. If that tape comes back with Scott's DNA, it's all over.
It's game over. It would be the first piece of physical evidence directly linking him to binding her.
But if it comes back with unknown male DNA, a full profile of someone who isn't Scott Peterson?
It blows the case wide open. The state would probably argue it's just marine debris that floated by and got stuck to her clothing. But the defense would argue it's the signature of the real killer they've been talking about for 2 decades. It is the one single thread left dangling.
It's incredible that after all this time, all the books, the movies, the trials, we're waiting on a lab result for a piece of tape. It just shows the permanence of these cases.
Yeah.
And the legacy extends beyond the courtroom itself. We have to mention Laci and Connor's Law.
Yes. Signed into law by President George W. Bush in 2004, it's officially the Unborn Victims of Violence Act. It made it a separate federal crime to harm a fetus during an assault on a pregnant woman.
It literally changed the law.
It did. That is a direct legislative result of this murder. Before this, in many jurisdictions, killing a pregnant woman was considered one murder. Now, legally, it is 2.
And on a personal level, Scott was denied the life insurance policy on Laci. That $250,000 went to Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha.
Which is standard. It's called the Slayer statute. You can't profit from a crime you committed.
So here we are, decades later. The perfect couple from the magazines is now a national cautionary tale. Laci and Connor are gone. Scott is in prison for life. The house on Covina Avenue has been sold and resold.
And yet we are still fascinated by it. I think it's because this case just hits on every single primal anxiety we have. The fear that we don't really know our partners, the fear that the perfect life is just a lie, and the fear that the justice system, which has to rely on circumstantial evidence, might get it right or might be swayed by a media narrative.
It really raises that final uncomfortable question. Does being a cheater inevitably lead to being labeled a killer in the eyes of the public? Because, let's be honest, if Scott Peterson hadn't been lying to Amber Frey, would the jury have convicted him on the fishing trip evidence alone?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? The lies convicted him in the court of public opinion and maybe in the jury room as much as the bodies did. But then you look at the timeline, the anchors, the location of the bodies. It is a very, very heavy weight of coincidence if he is an innocent man.
A heavy weight indeed. We'll be watching for those duct tape results. But for now, that is the deep dive into the murder of Laci Peterson. Let us know what you think was justice served, or are there still critical pieces missing?
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.